The Frank Conley stare down. Frank blinks. The pure uniqueness of the Conley-Frank courtroom drama must be viewed in full American racial context. In the post-slavery South, a black man, woman, or child who talked back to a white man was considered suicidal. A black man accusing a white man of any crime, much less that of murder, was uncharted racial territory. Not uncharted in terms of whether he would face a public execution. That was assured. Just how many of the man's family, friends, and neighbors might be collaterally slaughtered was the only unknown in the equation. Collective punishments, including wholesale massacres of blacks for the slightest perceived offenses, had become part and parcel of American race relations. In 1955, more than 4 decades after Mary Phagan's murder, a black man named Mose Wright stood in a Mississippi court, and when asked to identify the white man he saw kidnap his murdered nephew, Emmett Till, he pointed to the white man and said, in common black country vernacular, quote, "Dar he," end quote. There he is. For that simple testimony, the 64-year-old Wright had to instantaneously leave Mississippi for good. Historian W. Fitzhugh Brundage reports that 1/4 of Georgia's reported mass mob lynchings involved, quote, torture, mutilation, and grisly ceremonies, end quote. None of the black victims of this gruesome system of white justice had even been charged with the acts that James Conley was now openly admitting to. Further, it was considered racial heresy for a white man to allow such black insolence to go unpunished, in that it was feared that such a display of black boldness would threaten the entire superstructure of white supremacy. Such a black man had to be forcibly put down, lest he, quote, infect with his audacity, end quote, everyone else's, quote, Negro property, end quote. All whites lived by this code without exception, and blacks, of course, had no option but to abide. But when Leo Frank was given the responsibility of confronting Conley face to face in the presence of white men of standing, Frank declined, claiming instead that he needed a specific one of his many lawyers to be present, who was then out of town. But attorney Luther Rosser soon returned, and Frank still avoided the head-to-head with Conley. American courtroom procedures have evolved in some respects since the 1910s, but in 1913, the age-old right to face one's accuser had not yet been confined to a courtroom procedure. And in the Southern society in which Frank lived and thrived, this kind of extrajudicial confrontation was as common as an arraignment is today. Chief of Detectives Newport A. Lanford made every attempt to arrange a Conley-Frank encounter in the presence of the grand jury. Not in the police station, the jail, or any environment to which Leo Frank might object. But according to the Constitution, quote, when word came to, end quote, Frank, quote, that the police chiefs and the Pinkerton man desired to confront him with Conley, the prisoner positively refused them an audience. End quote. His refusal to confront Conley amounted to sacrilege, a grievous offense, and for many Georgians it was akin to a guilty plea. For his part, the Negro, James Conley, matched Frank's meekness with a startling chutzpah, and was openly and publicly demanding the confrontation. The Georgian reported, quote, I'm anxious to face Mr. Frank and tell my story to his face, end quote. The prosecutor made a telling point in the common language of white supremacy, a language that Frank and Atlanta's Jewish community spoke fluently. Quote, I tell you, gentlemen of the jury, measuring my words as I utter them, and if you have got sense enough to get out of a shower of rain, you know it's true, that never in the history of the Anglo-Saxon race, never in the history of the African race in America, never in the history of any other race, did an ignorant, filthy Negro accuse a white man of a crime, and that man decline to face him. and there never lived within the state of Georgia a lawyer with one half the ability of Mr. Luther Rosser, who possessed a consciousness of his client's innocence, that wouldn't have said, "Let this ignorant Negro confront my innocent client. If there be a Negro who accuses me of a crime of which I am innocent, I tell you, and you know it's true, I'm going to confront him, even before my attorney, no matter who he is, returns from Tallulah Falls, and if not then, I tell you just as soon as that attorney does return, I'm going to see that that Negro is brought into my presence and permitted to set forth his accusations." End quote. It was not as if Frank could claim to be upholding some higher legal principle. Frank, though in custody himself, was asked to confront Newt Lee, because, said an investigator, quote, "I thought he could get more out of the nigger than we could." End quote. Frank willingly performed the interrogation of Lee without hesitation, or a request for the presence of his lawyers. That the request by law should go through Lee's attorney is not even an idea worth consideration by police officials. Frank's lead attorney, deep Southerner Luther Ziegler Rosser, had no choice but to defend his client by sinking even deeper into the swamp, calling the act of confronting Conley, quote, "a dirty farce with a dirty Negro." End quote. Whatever racial rarities the case now presented, James Conley's story was convincing. His description of the particulars of the crime scene too detailed to have been spun from whole cloth. When Conley was brought to the scene of the crime to reenact his story, he left the several white witnesses awestruck. A reporter from the Atlanta Georgian described how Conley's account and demeanor affected those who witnessed the reenactment. Quote, "The Negro appeared to be telling a straightforward story, and was ready with an answer whenever any of the officers asked him a question. The Negro went through the terrible tragedy movement by movement, without faltering for an instant, or hesitating as though he were not sure of his ground. Conley appeared perfectly composed as though he were reciting an everyday occurrence, but his earnest and apparently truthful bearing gave his dramatic story, told in a matter-of-fact way, a convincing power that evidently had its effect on everyone who was listening to his recital." End quote. He, quote, "did not hesitate for a moment during the entire time he was showing his part in the crime, and his frankness of speech and clock-like work impressed the officers that he was at last telling the exact truth." End quote. And at trial. Quote, "Conley testified with dramatic rapidity. He repeated the alleged conversations with Frank verbatim. At no time did he display any uncertainty." End quote. Conley's on-scene account corroborated and added crucial detail to the prosecution's theory of the crime, and it had a devastating effect on Leo Frank's alibi. By this time, the Frank team's dogged pursuit of Newt Lee had no takers among both the press and the investigators, who now were convinced that the night watchman was an innocent victim of a frame-up. For many, the pre-trial coup de grace came when Pinkerton detective Harry Scott broke cleanly from the Frank camp with these words, quote, "There is not a doubt that the Negro," end quote, Conley, quote, "is telling the truth, and it would be foolish to doubt it. The Negro couldn't go through the actions like he did unless he had done this just like he said. We believe that we have at last gotten to the bottom of the Phagan mystery. Conley's confession fits exactly in with our theory." End quote. While Georgians had given the benefit of the doubt to Frank as a fellow white man, the weight of Conley's account put their doubts to rest. He had an incredible story to tell, and it was becoming clear to Atlantans following the case that Leo Frank and his legal team were not as surprised about James Conley as they claimed to be. This growing suspicion put Frank's advocates in a precarious position. Winning the case now required more than simple denials. They would have to set their sights entirely on the destruction of the black man, James Conley. Leo Frank builds a Negro defense. Was he really guilty? Quote, I studied all I could, and I can't figure it out still. End quote. Dr. Jeffrey Melnick. Quote, I think there was a reasonable case against Leo Frank. End quote. Steve Oney. Since the murder of Mary Phagan on April 26, 1913, Frank's theory of the crime was a moving target. He at first claimed he did not know Mary Phagan and pointed to the employee he had fired, James Gant, who had visited the factory that Saturday looking for his shoes. But when Frank told police that Gant had had a romantic interest in the victim, he in effect confirmed that he did indeed know Mary Phagan. Thus, he drew more suspicion to himself rather than to Gant, who was soon released from custody. But Gant's presence at the factory had another unintended consequence, which severely limited Frank's alibi options. James Gant arrived at 6:00 p.m. just after night watchman Newt Lee returned to the factory, and just as Frank was leaving for the day. 2 hours earlier, Lee had arrived as scheduled, but Frank inexplicably sent him away, telling him to return at 6. With the three having met in the front hallway area, Gant became the only white man who could corroborate that Newt Lee had actually seen Leo Frank. He thus foiled any plans Frank may have had to create a false itinerary for Lee, or for himself, or deny knowledge of Lee's movements. Frank could have insisted that Lee, who had a key to the factory, had come even earlier than 4 p.m., closer to the time of the murder, and no one but Newt Lee, a, quote, long, slim, tall Negro, end quote, as described in the murder notes, would have been any wiser. Frank's startled reaction upon seeing Gant at the factory at 6 p.m. the night of the murder may have been, in part, a realization that engineering Newt Lee's conviction would be far more challenging. Still, the Frank team pressed police to indict the friendless night watchman, even clumsily planting evidence to help the police with their investigation. But Lee's steadfast and unwavering self-defense beat back the lynch mobs and cleared him in the minds of Atlantans. And though Lee continued to be jailed during the trial, most suspicion in the popular mind shifted firmly to Leo Frank. Abandoning their attempts to implicate Newt Lee, Frank's legal team moved to target the second black man, James Conley. Conley's late May confession upset the dynamics of the case and Frank's legal approach to it. Without Conley, the state's case was compelling but not fully convincing. The integrity, connections, and whiteness of the defendant and the youth, gender, and lower economic station of the victim conspired to give the legal advantage to Leo Frank. If Frank simply continued to maintain that he had no knowledge of the crime, his high-octane legal team could very likely achieve an acquittal. Conley's detailed account, however, forced Frank into a position that required he provide specific explanations, not general denials. If Conley testified in court as convincingly as he had in public, the jury would need more than a simple claim of ignorance to acquit Leo Frank. The defense's response was to attack Conley, first as a, quote, Negro, end quote, then as a person of bad moral character, and obliterate his claims about Frank being the murderer of Mary Phagan. They countercharged that, quote, the Negro Conley, end quote, was the lone murderer, whose motive was straight robbery. It was simple, they said. Quote, a drunken James Conley entered the building about 9:40 a.m. in pursuit of Miss Mattie Smith, who came to collect her pay. Conley lay in wait with the intention of robbing her, but he was deterred when she came down the stairs with factory personnel manager N.V. Darley. End quote. Frank's defense team. Quote, later, he saw little Mary Phagan come in and waited until she came down. Then he grabbed her and tried to get her purse. A scuffle by the elevator ensued, and the Negro knocked the girl down the elevator shaft. end quote, to the basement. Quote, he quickly followed her, going down by the trap door. He found her cut and bruised and unconscious. Then he tied the cord around her neck and choked her to death. He wrote the notes himself, and then he pulled the staple off the rear basement door and left the place. End quote. That murder scenario was followed up with a description of Conley's character that made him the obvious suspect. Quote, is it not more reasonable that Mary Phagan, passing down the stairway out of the factory from the office floor to the street floor, down the very stairway, near where Conley was lurking in the darkness, under the influence of liquor, passions aroused, and hard up for money, was set upon the girl and thrust down the trap door to the basement? As the murder note sets forth, Conley follows her down and completes her undoing and accomplishes her death, breaks open the alley door of the basement, and escapes from, end quote, the, quote, building, end quote. Attorney Reuben Arnold elaborated at trial. Quote, it was the crime of a savage Negro, whose first attack is violence because he cannot accomplish his object in any other way. End quote. He added, quote, we don't know how long it took the nigger to kill the child. End quote. Frank's defense team relied on this theory at trial, and it has been more or less the root theory that for a century has satisfied numerous case analysts. But to accept this theory and its embellishments in any meaningful way, one must necessarily reconcile it with an implausible set of assumptions. For instance, one must believe that a 27-year-old black man who lives in 1913 Georgia, a state that led the nation in premeditated, wanton, and cold-blooded public murders of black men, lynchings preceded by ghastly tortures, burnings alive, and living dismemberments, castrations, and amputations, would target for robbery an adolescent white girl, then rape and murder her, hide her body at their workplace, and then write notes about it. That on his day off, Conley would choose his place of long-term employment to perpetrate the crime of robbery against fellow employees, knowing that his fastidious white boss was only a few feet away, and that other white men were on floors above, within a few feet of an open front door through which many other white people, employees and non-employees, were regularly entering and exiting. That Conley, after allegedly committing the murder, makes no effort to flee the state. Instead, as testimony would show, he gets some food, relaxes at home, and then returns to the scene of Saturday's crime at his usual time for work on Monday morning. That, having no history of robbery, rape, or murder, Conley would prefer to rob Mary Phagan of $1.20, when he only had to ask Frank, or any of the other employees, to advance him money. And Frank, and Conley's co-workers, had done so willingly, several times. Frank even seemed to have become Conley's own personal banker. That, even if Conley were intent on robbery, he would choose a young 13-year-old girl who held one of the lowest-paying jobs of the workforce, and that he would think her to be a better target than Leo Frank, who was alone in his office only 20 to 25 feet away, and who Conley knew possessed on his person and in his safe maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of company payroll dollars. Several other employees were in the factory that morning, all of whom in positions or with incomes higher than those of either Maddie Smith or Mary Phagan, and all had passed by Conley unmolested. Conley would have been the only black man in Western Hemispheric history who expected he could get away with such a crime. Jewish scholar Harry Simonhoff admitted, quote, the Georgian custom took care of a Negro rapist without bothering about a trial, end quote. One could face a horrifying demise for complaining about wages, for having land or crops that a white man coveted, even for pursuing an education or for not answering a white man with the requisite inflections of submission. It is far, far more likely that a white male factory owner who employed dozens of adolescent girls and had a history of extramarital sexual relations, a fact admitted by Frank's defense, would use his authoritative position to gain sexual advantage over the females he hired. Not only is it an entirely conceivable scenario, but it is an accurate subtext of America's industrial expansion. Black American women, North and South, had been continual victims of this kind of white male exploitation for centuries, to such a degree that white male rapists produced an entirely new race they called mulattoes, the living evidence of the frequency of this fiendish behavior. As historian Nell Painter stated in the television production The People vs. Leo Frank, quote, "One of the prime complaints of women in the workforce was their being preyed upon by men." End quote. It is impossible for those predators to have been black men. In reality, an extraordinary set of facts, indeed a mountain of evidence pointing to Frank's guilt, had to be in force for Conley to escape the legendary Southern lust for black blood. Frank's theory falters for all those obvious reasons, but Frank's own testimony negates his own murder scenario implicating, quote, the Negro Conley, end quote. Just 2 days after the murder, the Atlanta Georgian quotes a not yet arrested Leo Frank. Mary Phagan, quote, "went out through the outer office, and I heard her talking to another girl. Well, I could not swear that they went out of the building. I am quite sure they did, for I would have noticed anyone moving about the building." End quote. Frank's fresh, unfiltered, and unlawyered recollection negates his later charge of robbery and tends to clear James Conley. In fact, the Georgian reported that at 12:10 p.m., Saturday, Mary Phagan appeared at the National Pencil Factory, drew the pay due her, and, quote, chatted a few minutes with friends. The manager is sure she then left the building, end quote. Months later, when giving his statement in court, Frank is less definite. Quote, "She continued on her way out, and I heard the sound of her footsteps as she went away. It was a few moments after she asked me this question that I had an impression of a female voice saying something. I don't know which way it came from. Just passed away and I had that impression." End quote. Frank's continually changing accounts of his critical encounter with Mary Phagan stood feebly next to the testament of Conley, which by comparison appeared to be set in stone. Circumstances had now forced Frank's legal team to press forward with their racist insistence that the murder was a, quote, Negro crime, end quote, and that consequently a Negro must be held accountable. But Frank's theory was about to take another blow with the introduction of yet another white witness whose experience at the factory that day severely weakened Frank's latest alibi and gave Conley's account another boost of believability. Mrs. White's Negro sighting. One of the most damning revelations in the case surfaced almost by mistake, but it has become pivotal to understanding why so many were convinced that Leo Frank was indeed the murderer of Mary Phagan. And it involved his apparent hiding from authorities, the man who all of Frank's supporters claim was the actual murderer, James Conley. Leo Frank steadfastly claimed that he had no knowledge that James Conley was anywhere on the premises on the day of the murder, and Conley maintained that he was at the factory only because Frank had asked him to stand sentry as Frank, quote, chatted, end quote, privately with his female visitors. Mary Phagan arrived at the factory just after noon and was believed to have been murdered a short time after that. During the crucial noon to 1 o'clock time frame, at least 4 people were at several different locations in the large and nearly vacant 4-story factory. Among them were 2 workmen renovating part of the 4th floor and Leo Frank working in his office on the 2nd floor. One of the workers, named Arthur White, was visited at 12:30 p.m. by his wife Maggie, who brought him lunch just moments after the probable time of the murder. When she walked down the stairs to leave the building at about 12:50 p.m., Mrs. White reported that she saw an unfamiliar black man sitting near the elevator on the first floor, an observation she reported to the plant's personnel manager, N.V. Darley, once the tragedy became known. Darley then told Leo Frank, but according to Frank himself, he, quote, sent a messenger bearing this intelligence, end quote, to his own hired investigator, Pinkerton agent Harry Scott, but not to the police. In fact, the story was not pursued for a full 12 days, until an Atlanta city detective thought to re-interview Mrs. White on that 13th day. Frank himself, who was arrested on April 29th, sat in jail accused of murder for almost 2 weeks without mentioning this crucial sighting by Mrs. White. Prosecutor Hugh Dorsey believed that, after first being forthcoming about what she had witnessed, Mrs. White became less so and implied that pressure from Frank's team was the reason. Quote, we've shown that Frank knew of this disclosure on April 28th, and now we expect to show that, although Detective Bass Rosser questioned this woman here on that same day, that she refused to disclose this information to him or to any detective working for the state, and that the state never knew of it until May 27th. End quote. The, quote, unidentified Negro, end quote, that Mrs. White saw that day was obviously James Conley, who had positioned himself near the stairwell where he claimed Frank told him to sit as his lookout. Mrs. White's exit at 12:50 would have been about 40 minutes after Mary Phagan's murder and 6 minutes before Frank called Conley up to the second floor to help him conceal the body. It does not take much of a sleuth to appreciate the salvational power of this casual Conley sighting. Yet Frank and his team appeared suspiciously unable to grasp its value to their cause. Frank had retained the services of a highly experienced team of lawyers and detectives. Luther Z. Rosser had achieved a legendary status as a defense lawyer in the state of Georgia, as did attorney Reuben Arnold. And the Pinkerton Detective Agency was the nation's most feared and respected outfit of its kind. Herbert and Leonard Haas were the National Pencil Company's attorneys, both well-known and highly respected in their field. An innocent Leo Frank and his formidable squad of professional defenders would have instantaneously seen Mrs. White's Negro sighting as no less than heaven sent, and would have made it central to Frank's defense. But they said and did nothing to pursue that lead, or to force the police or the press to pursue it. It was only when Atlanta detective Bass Rosser pressed the issue that the Frank team was no longer able to ignore that evidence. Why Frank concealed Mrs. White's Negro. How could a strange, unknown, unexplained, unchaperoned, uninvited black man be seen lingering anywhere near the scene of a murdered white girl, and the news of this not lead to a sweeping, full-throttled manhunt by police? Frank and his hired detectives? Indeed, Frank had already publicly declared the murder to be, quote, a Negro crime, end quote, a position he and his defenders held right on up until his own lynching in August of 1915. The only logical explanation is as Conley claimed. Frank was sticking to the arrangement he had made with Conley to keep silent about the day's tragic events. According to Conley, Frank had instructed him to keep their association a secret, counting on each other's silence to weather the storm. And both held to that pact. But when investigators learned of Mrs. White's Negro and sought to identify him, they began asking hard questions of the, quote, Negro sweeper, end quote, they already had in custody. It has been claimed by some writers that Conley had eluded serious suspicion because he was assumed to be illiterate and thus unable to write the notes left near the body. This alleged illiteracy, we are to believe, overruled the cause of his arrest, that he was caught washing blood from his shirt at the scene of an unsolved murder. In any event, it turns out that Leo Frank was in possession of a loan receipt signed by Conley, indicating that he, Frank, had been paying the jewelry store $1 a week from Conley's salary for a purchase he had made. In fact, Conley had signed the contract in front of Leo Frank. Frank thus knew of Conley's ability to write, but never volunteered that information. When Frank was confronted with this, he claimed that it was he, Frank, who revealed to police that Conley could write, and thus made Conley a serious suspect. Both the police and the Pinkerton detectives denied Frank had made any such statement to them at all. Steve Oney's research confirms the Pinkerton/police version, finding no record of Frank's claim. The reality is that Frank knew the significance of Mrs. White's observation. Investigators had deduced that the Negro they had in custody could write and had been present at the crime scene when the crime had been committed, a fact that could no longer be contained. As scholar Albert Lindemann admitted, Frank, quote, did not even mention Conley to the police until it was unavoidable, as if he feared to have Conley interrogated, end quote. Had Mrs. White's observation been suppressed, as the Frank team tried to have done, Conley would never have been connected to the scene, and Newt Lee, believed to be the only black man anywhere near the scene of this horrific Negro crime, would probably have paid with his life. Frank said nothing to relieve Lee, even though he had knowledge of another likely suspect. Frank, instead, urged police, through concocted and planted evidence, to shift suspicion to the night watchman. When the episode was aired at Frank's trial, his lawyers actually tried to have White's evidence thrown out, calling it, quote, irrelevant, immaterial, and not binding, end quote. They were unsuccessful. It was so significant that when revealed during the trial, the Atlanta Constitution reported the reaction of the audience. Quote, it was at this moment that something occurred that had never occurred before during the progress of the trial. A burst of applause swept through the courtroom, and several people clapped their hands, loudly, as though applauding at the theater something that met their approval. The deputies immediately began rapping for order, and Judge Roan announced from the bench that such actions would not be tolerated. End quote. To the lay audience, and certainly to the jury of his peers, Frank's apparent indifference to the news of a black suspect, or, worse, his concealment of that man, was yet more proof of the defendant's guilt. Add to this the damaging testimony of a solid Frank supporter, his second-in-command at the factory, Herbert Schiff. At trial and under oath, he admitted, quote, I knew on Monday, end quote, April 28th, quote, that Mrs. White claimed she saw a Negro there, end quote. 3-year employee Mrs. E.M. Carson testified that a group of factory employees were discussing the murder when they returned to work on the Monday morning, immediately after Saturday's crime. Not only were they already aware of and commenting on Mrs. White's sighting, but they had further speculated that the black man she saw must have been the killer. Mrs. Carson further testified that she said these words directly to James Conley, who had returned to the factory for work as usual on Monday. Quote, Jim, whenever they find the murderer of Mary Phagan, it's going to be that nigger that was sitting near the elevator when Mrs. White went upstairs. End quote. This shows that even though Frank said he was totally unaware of it, a black man's presence at the murder scene was common knowledge immediately after the crime was committed, even among the rank-and-file factory employees. And in their minds, that fact was central to Frank's exoneration. If these amateur observers could so quickly deduce those facts, one must just as quickly deduce that the silence of Leo Frank and his team of lawyers and private investigators corroborates Conley's version of events. When the fact of Conley's presence confronted Frank, he realized that his only option was to, quote, cut Conley loose, end quote, as it were, and he moved, for the second time, to pin his crime on a black man. Frank and his partisans have tried to address that incredibly damning behavior by posing Frank as the hero of the episode, he having revealed to the police Conley's ability to write. As previously shown, there is no record of that claim. But according to the Georgian, early on in the investigation, Frank took charge. Quote, The canvass of employees was made under the direction of Frank himself." End quote. Just before his arrest, Frank told the paper that, quote, "Every one of the foremen and head men about the factory is endeavoring to find out if any of the employees know anything." End quote. If Frank had truly intended to find the murderer, he, having knowledge of Mrs. White's lurking Negro, could have simply assembled all his black employees to determine their exact whereabouts on that day and to administer a writing test. And Conley would have been at the top of that writer's list, by Frank's own personal knowledge. Nor did any of the other white employees speak up, several of whom claimed that they had always known of Conley's ability to write. Herbert Schiff, who was involved in the investigation from the beginning, was very clear in his testimony. Quote, "I knew that Jim could write. I have given him and the other Negroes tablets like this." End quote. States Exhibit H. Quote, "They are kept everywhere in the factory. They would go down in the basement and write." End quote. The handling of Mrs. White's revelation by Frank and his team of practiced legal veterans is possibly the most compelling evidence of Frank's guilt. That they would allow the arrest, confinement, and persecution of their prominent and wealthy white client before a full investigation of the lurking black man was simply gross, unforgivable legal malpractice, and on a broader but no less important level, racial malfeasance. The incident was also a problem for Charles and Louise Samuels, authors of the book Night Fell on Georgia. They wrote that Frank, quote, "always insisted that he passed on this information to the police." End quote. But they added, quote, "Why this promising lead was never followed up remains one of the baffling features of the case." End quote. Be with us again next time when we present the next chapter of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 3. The Leo Frank Case, The Lynching of a Guilty Man. Prepared by the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam, Chicago, Illinois. Copyright 2016 by Latimer Associates. All rights reserved. Published in audiobook form by the American Mercury with permission of the Historical Research Department of the Nation of Islam. 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 Of the Nation of